You think you know how your brain works. You think reality is solid, perception is reliable, and that the person staring back at you in the mirror every morning is, well, you. You trust your eyes to show you what's there, your hands to do what you tell them, your mind to recognize the people you love. It's such a fundamental assumption that you probably never even think about it, consciously, like breathing. It just happens. But here's the uncomfortable truth that psychologists don't advertise on motivational posters, that neuroscientists whisper about in research labs, and that most people go their entire lives without confronting. Your brain is lying to you, constantly, elaborately, convincingly. Every single moment of your waking life, your brain is taking incomplete sensory data, making educated guesses, filling in massive gaps with assumptions, and presenting you with what it confidently calls reality. And most of the time, this system works well enough that you never notice the deception. You navigate the world, recognize faces, control your body, maintain your sense of self, all without questioning whether any of it is actually real or just a very convincing simulation your neurons are running. But sometimes, and this is where things get genuinely disturbing, the system breaks. Not in small, ignorable ways, not in that's weird ways. We're talking catastrophic failures where the fundamental building blocks of consciousness collapse, where perception becomes unmoored from reality, where the boundaries between self and other dissolve completely. And when that happens, you get psychological phenomena so bizarre, so reality warping, that they sound like they were ripped straight from horror movies or science fiction novels. Except they're not fiction. They're documented in peer-reviewed medical journals. They're happening to real people right now, in hospitals and homes around the world. People who wake up one morning and can no longer recognize their own reflection. People whose hands move with minds of their own, acting with intention and sometimes hostility completely separate from their conscious will. People who are absolutely unshakably convinced they're dead, that their organs are rotting, their blood has stopped flowing, their existence has ended, even while they're walking, talking, and arguing with doctors who insist they're alive. This is weird psychology at its most extreme, and it reveals something that should terrify and fascinate you in equal measure. The line between sanity and madness, between reliable perception and complete delusion, is so thin that a single misfiring neuron, one damaged connection in your brain's wiring, can send you tumbling into a reality that no one else can see or validate. Most people go through life assuming their perception is basically accurate. Sure, optical illusions exist, those fun images where stairs go up and down simultaneously, or where you can see either a vase or two faces, depending on how you look. But those are party tricks, right? Deliberate visual puzzles designed to exploit known quirks in visual processing. Your day-to-day experience of reality, though, that's solid, that's trustworthy, that's objective truth being delivered directly to your conscious awareness. Except it's not even close. Your brain is running on evolutionary firmware that was designed millions of years ago with one primary goal: keep you alive long enough to reproduce. Truth, accuracy, objective reality, those were never priorities. What mattered was speed, efficiency, and good enough approximations that let your ancestors avoid predators, find food, and recognize threats before those threats killed them. So your brain developed shortcuts, lots of shortcuts. It samples tiny bits of sensory data and extrapolates the rest based on past experience and statistical probability. It predicts what you're about to see before you see it, and then retroactively adjusts your perception to match those predictions. It filters out irrelevant information constantly, which is why you don't consciously feel your clothes touching your skin right now unless I specifically draw your attention to it. And it stitches together a coherent narrative of selfhood and agency from what is actually a chaotic mess of competing neural processes, none of which have a clear you in charge. This works brilliantly until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the results range from mildly unsettling to absolutely nightmarish. Think about the woman who looked at her husband of 20 years, the man she'd built a life with, raised children with, shared a bed with for 2 decades, and suddenly saw a stranger. Not, he looks different today, or I'm not sure I recognize him. Complete total absence of familiarity. Her brain's recognition system crashed, and for 3 hours, the most important person in her life was just a random man sitting in her kitchen, wearing her husband's clothes, speaking with a voice that should have been comforting but instead felt alien and wrong. She knew intellectually it was him. She could recite facts about their relationship, their history, but the feeling of knowing him, that deep sense of recognition that makes love possible, was gone, erased, and she was trapped in that cognitive dissonance, her rational mind saying, "This is absurd," while her perception screamed, "Danger, stranger, this is not your husband." Or consider the man whose left hand, after brain surgery, developed what can only be described as a hostile personality. It would grab his throat while he slept, hard enough to wake him gasping, his own fingers wrapped around his windpipe, squeezing with intent to harm. During the day, it would throw objects, slap his face, turn on stove burners while he leaned over them. He had to physically restrain his own hand, fighting against himself in the most literal sense possible, never knowing when it would attack next. These aren't metaphors. These aren't exaggerations. These are documented cases of human behavior breaking down in ways that reveal just how constructed, how fragile, how utterly dependent on properly functioning neurology our sense of reality really is. So why should you care about these extreme, rare cases that you'll probably never personally experience? Because they're not as rare as you think, and more importantly, they're revealing fundamental truths about perception, consciousness, and identity that apply to everyone, including you. You've experienced tiny versions of these phenomena, even if you didn't recognize them for what they were. That moment where you typed a common word and suddenly it looked completely wrong, like someone had changed the spelling while you weren't looking. That's mild jamais vu, your brain temporarily failing to attach familiarity to something you've known your entire life. That time you looked in a mirror and for just a split second didn't quite recognize yourself, saw your face as a stranger would see it. That's your self-recognition system glitching. That sensation of watching your hand perform a familiar task while feeling oddly disconnected from it, like you're observing someone else's actions. That's a tiny taste of what alien hand syndrome patients experience constantly, and it happens to normal people more often than they admit. These extreme psychological conditions are essentially amplifications, dramatic exaggerations of processes that are running in your brain right now. Understanding them isn't morbid curiosity or academic trivia. It's a roadmap to understanding your own consciousness, recognizing when your brain might be feeding you incomplete or false information, and developing the awareness to question perceptions you've always taken for granted. This is about more than just learning weird facts. This is about understanding the machinery of your own mind and realizing that reality, your reality, the one you're experiencing right this second, is a lot more negotiable, a lot more constructed, and a lot less reliable than you've ever been told. By the end of this deep dive into strange and unusual psychological phenomena, you're going to see the world differently, not in some vague metaphorical way, literally differently. You're going to catch yourself questioning perceptions, noticing the gaps your brain fills in automatically, recognizing moments where familiarity might be fabricated or where your sense of control might be an illusion. And honestly, that's exactly what should happen, because weird psychology isn't just fascinating, it's a survival guide. It's a manual for navigating a mind that evolved to keep you alive, not to show you truth. It's a warning that the person you think you are, the reality you think you perceive, and the control you think you have are all constructed phenomena that can collapse without warning. And once you know that, once you really internalize how unreliable your own consciousness is, you'll never trust your perceptions quite the same way again, which sounds scary, but it's actually empowering, because awareness is the first step to working with your brain's quirks instead of being victimized by them. So buckle up. We're about to explore 5 psychological phenomena that will make you question everything you thought you knew about being human. And I promise you, by the time we're done, reality is going to feel a lot less solid than it did 10 minutes ago. Topico 1. O fenomeno de jamais vu extremo. Look, here's the thing most people don't realize about their brain. It's constantly playing tricks on you, and sometimes those tricks get so weird that you'll question whether reality itself just glitched. Ever stared at a word you've written 1,000 times and suddenly it looks wrong? Like someone swapped it with an alien symbol while you weren't looking. That's a tiny glimpse into what psychologists call jamais vu, the opposite of déjà vu. But we're not talking about the mild version where door suddenly looks misspelled. We're diving into the extreme end of this strange psychological phenomenon where people look at their own hands, their spouse's face, or their childhood home and feel absolutely nothing. No recognition, no familiarity, just the cold, unsettling sensation that they're encountering these things for the very first time, even though logically they know that's impossible. This isn't some rare, one-in-a-million thing either. It's documented, it's real, and it's happening to people who thought their minds were rock solid. The terrifying part? Your brain doesn't warn you when it's about to pull this stunt. One second you're living your normal life, and the next, the person sitting across from you at breakfast, the one you've loved for 20 years, suddenly has the face of a complete stranger. Let's break down what's actually happening when this weird psychology kicks in. Your brain is essentially a pattern recognition machine running on autopilot most of the time. When you see your husband's face, your brain doesn't actually see him fresh each time. It retrieves a mental template, a compressed file of husband that includes emotional associations, memories, and that warm sense of familiarity. It's efficient, but it's also fragile. When jamais vu strikes in its extreme form, that retrieval system crashes, the template file gets corrupted or temporarily unavailable, and your brain suddenly has to process this familiar face as raw visual data with zero emotional context attached. Imagine opening a photo on your computer and the metadata is gone. No date, no location, no connection to anything. That's what your husband's face becomes, just shapes, colors, features arranged in a configuration that should mean something but doesn't. Studies on this strange and unusual psychological phenomenon show that the temporal lobe, particularly the areas responsible for recognition and memory integration temporarily misfires. It's not that you forgot who the person is intellectually. You can still recite facts about them, but the feeling of knowing them, gone, erased. And that absence of feeling creates an existential horror that facts can't fix. You're stuck in this cognitive dissonance where your mind knows this is my husband, but your perception screams this is a stranger, and the brain doesn't have an emergency protocol for that kind of conflict. Now here's where it gets even more unsettling, and why this ties into human behavior in ways most people never consider. When someone experiences extreme jamais vu, their first instinct isn't usually to think, oh, interesting neurological glitch. It's panic, pure primal panic, because if you can't trust your brain to recognize the most fundamental anchors of your reality, your own hand, your partner's face, your mother's voice, then what can you trust? This is where psychology intersects with philosophy in the messiest way possible. There's a documented case of a woman who looked at her husband during dinner and spent 3 hours convinced he was an imposter, not metaphorically. She was genuinely, viscerally certain that this man was a stranger who had somehow replaced her real husband. Her rational mind kept trying to intervene. That's ridiculous. It's obviously him, but her perception wouldn't budge. And here's the kicker. During those 3 hours, she said it was like living in a horror movie where everyone else is pretending everything's normal, but you can see the truth. That's the nightmare fuel of weird psychology. It doesn't just mess with what you see. It isolates you in a reality no one else can access or validate. Eventually, the effect wore off. The template file rebooted. Familiarity came flooding back. But the memory of those 3 hours, that stays. And once you know your brain is capable of that, you start wondering, how often is my perception just wrong? How much of reality is actually real versus just my brain's best guess? And maybe, just maybe, that's why this phenomenon connects to something deeper in all of us. We've all felt that split second where something familiar looked strange, where we double-checked our own reflection, where we questioned if we're perceiving the world the same way everyone else does. Topico 2. Syndrome de mão alienígena. Now, if you thought losing recognition of familiar things was disturbing, buckle up, because we're about to talk about losing control of your own body. Not in some abstract, metaphorical way. I mean literally watching your hand move, grab, and act with a will completely separate from yours. This is alien hand syndrome, and it's exactly as terrifying as it sounds. Picture this. You're sitting at your desk trying to write an email, and your left hand suddenly reaches up and starts unbuttoning your shirt. You didn't tell it to do that. You actively don't want it to do that, but it does it anyway, and you have to physically wrestle your own hand with your other hand to make it stop. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? Except it's documented in medical literature. It's happened to real people, and the psychological toll is absolutely devastating. This weird psychology phenomenon usually occurs after brain surgery, stroke, or trauma to the corpus callosum, the bridge connecting your brain's two hemispheres. When that connection is severed or damaged, one hand essentially gets cut off from your conscious control. It's still connected to your brain, just to a part that operates without your awareness or permission. And that's when things get genuinely nightmarish, because this isn't just about involuntary twitches or random movements. The alien hand acts with purpose, with intention, and sometimes with what seems like hostility toward you. Let's talk about Karen, a real case, documented in neurological studies. After brain surgery to control severe epilepsy, her left hand started doing things she absolutely did not consent to. It would grab her throat while she slept, not gently, hard enough that she'd wake up gasping, her own hand wrapped around her windpipe, squeezing. She'd have to pry the fingers off with her right hand, fighting against herself in the most literal sense possible. During the day, it wasn't much better. Her alien hand would grab objects and throw them. It would slap her own face. Once, while she was cooking, it turned the stove burner to maximum while she was leaning over it. The hand wasn't trying to cook, it was trying to burn her. Now here's where the psychology gets really strange and unusual. Karen knew intellectually that this was her hand. She could see it, feel the sensations from it, acknowledge it as part of her body. But emotionally, experientially, it was a foreign entity. She started referring to it as the hand instead of my hand. She'd apologize to people when it grabbed them without permission, as if she were responsible for someone else's actions. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, simultaneously being the victim and the perpetrator, the self and the other. Other patients have reported similar experiences. One man's alien hand would sabotage whatever his good hand was doing, building a tower of blocks. Alien hand knocks it down, buttoning a shirt. Alien hand unbuttoning right behind. It's like having a nemesis that you're physically attached to, and there's no escape because the call is literally coming from inside the house, inside your own nervous system. So what's actually going on here in terms of human behavior and brain function? Your sense of agency, that feeling that you're the one in control of your actions, is constructed by your brain. It's not a given. It's a conclusion your brain reaches based on integrating motor commands with sensory feedback. When you decide to pick up a cup, your brain sends the signal, monitors the execution, and generates that "I did that" feeling. But in alien hand syndrome, that integration breaks down. The motor cortex is still sending commands, but they're not coming from the part of your brain associated with conscious decision-making. They're coming from more primitive automatic systems, the kind that operated before you had complex thoughts and self-awareness. Your brain is essentially split into two operators, and only one of them is you. The other is running on autopilot with its own agenda. And because it's cut off from your conscious mind, it can act in ways that directly contradict your intentions. This raises profound questions about identity and free will that philosophy students write dissertations about. But for people living with this condition, it's not theoretical. It's a daily, visceral reminder that you might not be as unified as you thought. Some patients develop elaborate coping mechanisms, wearing oven mitts on the alien hand, sitting on it, giving it tasks to keep it busy, like holding a cane. One woman found that if she gave her alien hand a stuffed animal to hold, it would stay occupied and stop attacking her. It's like negotiating with a toddler, except the toddler is part of your own body and has the strength of your full arm behind it. And the scariest part? You can't reason with it, you can't train it, you can't make it understand, because it's you, but it's also not you. And that paradox is something the human mind wasn't designed to handle. Topic 03. Cotard delusion. Syndrome du cadavre ambulante. Alright, so we've covered brains that can't recognize familiar things and hands that betray their owners. But now we're stepping into territory that sounds like it was ripped straight from a zombie movie. Except it's not fiction, it's a documented psychological condition that's as real as it gets. Imagine waking up one morning with the unshakable conviction that you're dead. Not I feel like death in the metaphorical sense after a rough night. I mean genuinely, absolutely certain that you are a corpse. Your heart's still beating, you're still breathing, you can walk and talk and interact with the world, but none of that matters because your brain has decided with ironclad certainty that you died and somehow your body just kept going. This is Cotard delusion, also called walking corpse syndrome, and it's one of the most bizarre and disturbing examples of weird psychology you'll ever encounter. People with this condition report feeling their organs rotting inside them. They smell the decay, they're convinced their blood has stopped flowing, that their brain is dissolving, that they're nothing more than animated meat puppets going through the motions of life while being fundamentally, irreversibly dead. And here's the kicker. You can't logic someone out of this. You can show them their pulse, their reflection, medical scans proving they're alive. Doesn't matter. The delusion is stronger than evidence, stronger than reason, stronger than the most basic survival instinct we have. Because if you're already dead, what's there to fear? Let's talk about Graham, one of the most well-documented cases of Cotard delusion. After a severe depressive episode and a suicide attempt, Graham became convinced that his brain had died, not figuratively. He believed his physical brain had ceased functioning and was decomposing inside his skull. He could still think, still form sentences, still remember things, which should have been proof enough that his brain was working, but the delusion overrode all of that. He stopped eating because, as he put it, why would a dead person need food? He stopped bathing because corpses don't bathe. He would spend hours in cemeteries because that's where dead people belong, and he felt more at home there than anywhere else. His mother was desperate, taking him to doctor after doctor, but Graham would just stare at them with this empty expression and say, I know you think I'm alive, but I'm not. I died, and this is what's left. Brain scans revealed something fascinating and terrifying. The areas of Graham's brain responsible for emotional processing and self-recognition were showing activity levels similar to someone in a vegetative state. His brain was literally mimicking death while his body kept functioning. It's like his consciousness got stuck in some liminal space between life and death, and the delusion was his brain's way of making sense of that impossible state. Other patients have reported variations. Some believe they're missing organs, that their intestines are gone or their heart was removed. Others think they're immortal because you can't kill what's already dead, so they engage in reckless behavior with zero self-preservation instinct. Now here's where this strange and unusual psychological phenomenon gets philosophically unsettling. What does it mean to be alive? Most of us would say consciousness, right? If you're thinking, feeling, experiencing, you're alive. But Cotard delusion flips that completely. These people are conscious, they're aware, they're experiencing the world, and yet their subjective experience is one of being dead. So which is more real, the objective biological fact of their living body or their subjective experience of non-existence? This isn't just an academic question for people with Cotard. It's their daily reality, and it's a special kind of hell. Because death for most people is an ending. It's scary, but it's finite. You die, and then whatever comes next or nothing. But imagine being trapped in a state where you've died, but existence continues. You're a ghost in your own body, aware of your own decay, unable to escape, unable to die again because you're already dead. That's the nightmare of Cotard delusion. Treatment usually involves antipsychotics and antidepressants, and in some cases, electroconvulsive therapy has shown success. But recovery is complicated because you're not just treating a false belief. You're trying to restore someone's fundamental fundamental sense of being alive, and that's a psychological foundation most people never even think about because it's so automatic. When it breaks, rebuilding it requires convincing someone that their most certain perception of reality is wrong. And if your brain can convince you that you're dead while you're clearly alive, walking, talking, and reading this right now, what else is it lying to you about? What other certainties are just convincing illusions your brain has constructed? Topic 04. Troxler. Fading. Cuando rostros desaparecen. Here's something wild that you can actually test yourself, and honestly, you might want to after hearing this, because experiencing it firsthand is the only way to truly understand how fragile your perception really is. It's called the Troxler effect, and while it sounds like some obscure scientific term, what it does is straight-up horror movie material. Here's the setup. Sit across from someone in a dimly lit room, stare directly into their eyes without blinking, without moving your gaze, for about 10 minutes straight. Sounds simple, right? Uncomfortable maybe, but simple. Except here's what happens, and this is documented, this is real, this is replicable weird psychology. After a few minutes, their face will start to change. Not subtly, not like, oh, they look a bit different. We're talking full-on transformation. Features will distort, melt, morph into something unrecognizable. Some people report seeing monstrous faces, grotesque and nightmarish. Others see the face disappear entirely, leaving just a blank void where a human head should be. And the person you're staring at, they're seeing the exact same thing happen to your face. You're both sitting there, perfectly normal, perfectly alive, watching each other transform into something out of a fever dream. And the craziest part? It's not hallucination in the traditional sense. It's your brain's visual processing system glitching in real time. And once you understand why it happens, you'll realize just how much of what you see is actually your brain making educated guesses rather than showing you objective reality. So what's going on here in terms of human behavior and neuroscience? Your eyes are constantly making tiny movements called microsaccades, little involuntary jumps that refresh the visual information hitting your retina. This constant motion is essential because your visual neurons adapt to unchanging stimuli incredibly quickly. If an image stays perfectly stable on your retina, the neurons responsible for processing it essentially get bored and stop firing. It's like how you stop feeling your clothes a few minutes after putting them on. The sensation hasn't changed, so your brain filters it out to focus on new, potentially important information. This is called neural adaptation, and it happens with vision too. When you stare at someone's face without moving your eyes, you're forcing an unchanging image onto your retina. Your peripheral vision starts adapting first, which is why the face often seems to fade or distort at the edges before the center collapses. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Your brain hates information gaps. It's hardwired to fill in missing data, and when the visual input from your retinas starts dropping out due to adaptation, your brain just makes stuff up. It pulls from memory, from fears, from random neural noise, and stitches together something to fill the void. That's why people see different things: monsters, shadows, distortions, absences. The input is the same, a human face, but what your brain fabricates to replace the fading image is unique to you, drawn from your own psychological landscape. It's essentially your subconscious leaking into your perception, and that's both fascinating and deeply creepy. Some researchers have even suggested that this effect might explain certain supernatural encounters throughout history. People staring at others in candlelit rooms, watching faces transform, convinced they were seeing demons or spirits, when really they were just experiencing their own brains malfunctioning. Now here's why this matters beyond just being a cool party trick. Though honestly, don't try this at parties unless you want to seriously freak people out. The Troxler effect reveals something fundamental about consciousness and perception that most people never confront. You're not seeing reality. You're seeing your brain's best interpretation of reality, and that interpretation is constantly being edited, filtered, and sometimes straight up invented. Every moment of your life, your brain is making decisions about what visual information is important enough to show you and what can be ignored or fabricated. And usually, it does a pretty good job. Good enough that you never notice the shortcuts it's taking. But when you deliberately break the system by staring without moving, the curtain gets pulled back and you see the machinery at work. This connects to strange and unusual psychological phenomena across the board, because once you realize your visual perception isn't trustworthy under specific conditions, you start questioning everything. How many times have you been certain you saw something that wasn't there? How many times has your brain filled in details that didn't exist because it expected them to be there? The Troxler effect is just one dramatic example of a process that's happening constantly, invisibly, in the background of your consciousness. Your brain is constantly predicting what it's about to see based on past experience and current context, and then it retroactively adjusts your perception to match those predictions. This is why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. People aren't lying when they swear they saw something that video evidence later contradicts. They genuinely perceived it that way because their brain was running prediction software that filled in gaps with what should have been there. there. And if your brain can turn a normal human face into a monster just because you stared too long, what else is it quietly editing without you noticing? Tópico 5. Síndrome de Fregoli. Todo mundo é a mesma pessoa disfarçada. Okay, so we've been building up to this, and trust me, this one might be the most psychologically disturbing of them all. Not because of what it does to your body, but because of what it does to your sense of reality and trust. Imagine living in a world where everyone around you, your wife, your boss, the cashier at the grocery store, your therapist, the stranger on the bus, is actually the same person. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally the same individual, expertly changing disguises to follow you, surveil you, manipulate you. That barista who made your coffee this morning, same person as your neighbor. The doctor who just examined you, same person as the mailman. They're all masks, all costumes, all elaborate performances by one entity that's orchestrating your entire reality. This is Fregoli delusion, named after an Italian actor famous for his rapid costume changes, and it's a form of delusional misidentification that turns everyday life into a paranoid thriller where you're the only one who can see the truth. Except the truth is a complete fabrication of your malfunctioning brain. People with this condition don't just suspect this intellectually, they feel it with absolute certainty. They can see through the disguises. They recognize the same mannerisms, the same voice patterns, the same essence underneath all the different faces. And that certainty makes it terrifying, because if everyone is the same person in disguise, then no one is real. No relationship is genuine, and you're completely, utterly alone in a world constructed specifically to deceive you. Let's break down what's actually happening here in terms of weird psychology and neural misfiring. Your brain has specialized regions, particularly in the fusiform gyrus, dedicated to face recognition and person identification. These areas work in concert with your limbic system, the emotional processing center, to not just recognize who someone is, but to attach appropriate emotional context to that recognition. When you see your spouse, your brain doesn't just think this is Susan. It generates feelings of familiarity, affection, trust, all the accumulated emotional history of your relationship. In Fregoli delusion, this system breaks in a specific, bizarre way. The person can still recognize faces as distinct, but something in their brain is generating false signals of deep familiarity across multiple different people. So they look at the grocery store clerk and their brain fires off the same recognition pattern as when they see their therapist, and their conscious mind has to make sense of why these two obviously different people are triggering identical "I know this person" intimately responses. The brain solution? They must be the same person wearing different disguises. It's the only explanation that reconciles the conflicting data, and once that explanation takes root, it becomes a self-reinforcing delusion. Every interaction provides more evidence. The way the mailman walks reminds them of how their boss walks. Proof: the cashier has a similar laugh to their neighbor. Of course, it's the same person. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, even when those patterns don't exist. And Fregoli delusion is that pattern recognition software gone absolutely haywire, connecting dots that should never be connected and building an elaborate conspiracy theory that feels more real than reality itself. Now here's where this gets into truly disturbing psychological territory that touches on human behavior, trust, and identity. People with Fregoli delusion often develop elaborate theories about why this person is following them. Sometimes it's persecution. They're being stalked, surveilled, targeted. Other times it's something stranger. Maybe this shape-shifting entity is testing them, or protecting them, or preparing them for something. One documented case involved a man who became convinced that his wife, his co-workers, and random people on the street were all the same woman in disguise, and she was doing this because she was secretly a government agent assigned to monitor him after he'd supposedly witnessed something he shouldn't have. He hadn't witnessed anything. There was no agent, but his brain had constructed an entire narrative framework to explain the false familiarity signals it kept generating. Another woman believed that her abusive ex-boyfriend had somehow mastered the art of physical transformation and was following her everywhere, as her therapist, as her new boyfriend, as her sister, all of them him in disguise, all of them trying to gaslight her into thinking she was crazy when she was the only one seeing clearly. The tragedy is that from inside the delusion this makes perfect sense. It's logical, consistent, and explains everything they're experiencing. Trying to convince them otherwise is like trying to convince you that your mother isn't your mother. You'd think the person saying that was insane, because your perception and your certainty override any external evidence. Treatment typically involves antipsychotic medication and therapy, but it's complicated because the delusion often incorporates the treatment itself into its framework. The therapist trying to help, obviously another disguise. The medication, probably designed to make them compliant so they stop noticing the truth. This is the psychological horror of Fregoli. It doesn't just distort reality, it creates a reality that's resistant to correction, a closed loop of false certainty that's nearly impossible to escape. From inside, and for those of us hearing about about this from the outside, it's a reminder that trust in other people, the fundamental social contract that lets us function in society, is built on neurological processes that are way more fragile than we'd like to believe. So here we are, at the end of this deep dive into the bizarre, unsettling world of weird psychology. And if you're feeling a little uncomfortable right now, good. That means you've actually been paying attention, because the whole point of exploring these strange and unusual psychological phenomena isn't to freak you out for entertainment, though let's be honest, it's pretty fascinating. The point is to wake you up to a reality you've been sleepwalking through your entire life. Your brain is not showing you objective truth. It's showing you a heavily edited, assumption-filled, shortcut-riddled approximation of reality that's good enough to keep you functional, but nowhere near as reliable as you've been led to believe. And now that you know that, now that you've seen what happens when recognition systems crash, when hands develop separate agendas, when people become convinced they're dead or that everyone around them is the same person in disguise, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to blindly trusting every perception, every feeling of familiarity, every sense of control. And that's not a bad thing. That's the beginning of genuine awareness. Here's what I want you to do with this knowledge, because information without application is just trivia. Start paying attention to the moments when your perception glitches. When a familiar word suddenly looks wrong, don't just dismiss it. Recognize it as your brain's James view system activating. When you feel disconnected from your own actions, notice it. When you're absolutely certain about something and then evidence proves you wrong, don't just defend your position. Ask yourself how your brain constructed that false certainty in the first place. This is about developing metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, to recognize when your mental processes might be leading you astray. And it's not paranoia or overthinking, it's calibration. You're learning to work with your brain's quirks instead of being victimized by them. You're becoming aware of the machinery so you can spot when it's malfunctioning before it causes real damage to your relationships, your decisions, your life. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If your brain can make you not recognize your own spouse, make your hand attack you, convince you you're dead, make faces morph into monsters, or turn strangers into a single shape-shifting entity, all documented, all real, then what smaller, subtler distortions is it creating every single day that you're not catching? How many arguments have you had because your perception of a situation was fundamentally different from someone else's, and you were both convinced you were seeing objective reality? How many decisions have you made based on certainty that was really just your brain's pattern recognition software overfitting data? How much of your identity, your beliefs, your understanding of who you are is constructed rather than discovered? Now, I want you to do something. Think about one perception you hold with absolute certainty, something you know is true about yourself, about someone else, about how the world works. Got it? Now ask yourself, what if that certainty is just really convincing pattern matching by a brain that evolved to keep you alive, not to show you truth? What evidence would you need to question it? And more importantly, would you even accept that evidence? Or would your brain find a way to dismiss it to preserve the comfortable narrative it's built? Because that's what these psychological phenomena teach us. The brain will fight to maintain its constructed reality, even when confronted with contradictory data. It's not malicious, it's just doing what it's programmed to do. But you, with conscious awareness, with understanding of how these systems work, you have the power to override those automatic processes. You can choose to question, to investigate, to hold your certainties lightly instead of gripping them so tightly that you break when they're challenged. That's the real lesson here. Not your brain is broken, but your brain is human, and humans have exploitable bugs in their cognitive software, and awareness of those bugs is the first step to mitigating their impact. So what are you going to do differently now? Are you going to keep trusting your perception blindly, assuming that what you see is what's real, that what you feel is accurate, that your sense of self and control is unassailable? Or are you going to start living with productive uncertainty, questioning not to the point of paralysis, but to the point of wisdom? Are you going to recognize that the person arguing with you might genuinely be perceiving a different reality because their brain constructed the situation differently than yours did? Are you going to extend that same grace to yourself when you realize you were wrong about something you were certain about? This is about humility in the face of consciousness's limitations, but it's also about empowerment, because once you know how the magic trick works, you're less likely to be fooled by it. You're less likely to fall into cognitive traps, less likely to be manipulated by people exploiting these vulnerabilities, more likely to make decisions based on tested reality rather than comfortable assumptions. And that's a survival advantage in a world that's increasingly designed to exploit your brain's shortcuts for profit, for clicks, for control. Here's my challenge to you, and I want you to actually do this, not just nod and move on. Find someone you trust and try the Troxler effect. Sit across from them in dim lighting, stare into their eyes without blinking for 10 minutes, and watch their face transform. Experience firsthand how unreliable your visual system is when pushed just slightly outside normal parameters. Feel that unsettling moment when familiarity dissolves and something alien emerges. And then, when it's over and their face returns to normal, sit with the discomfort of knowing that your brain just spent 10 minutes lying to you about objective reality. Let that sink in. Let it change how you approach certainty, because that experience will do more for your understanding of human behavior, psychology, and consciousness than 100 articles or videos ever could. You need to feel it, not just know it intellectually. And once you've felt it, once you've experienced your own perception betraying you in real time, you'll never look at reality quite the same way again. And that's the point. That's the gift these weird psychological phenomena offer us. Not comfort, not certainty, but awareness. Raw, uncomfortable, empowering awareness. If this resonated with you, if you're one of the rare people who actually wants to understand the machinery of consciousness instead of just accepting comfortable illusions, then you need to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we're not done exploring the edges of psychology, the places where human behavior breaks down and reveals the underlying mechanisms. We're going to keep diving into the strange, the unusual, the phenomena that make you question everything you thought you knew about being human. Next time, we're going into even weirder territory, the psychological conditions that blur the line between self and other, where identity becomes fluid and the question, who am I, becomes genuinely unanswerable. You think what we covered today was unsettling. You haven't seen anything yet, but you'll only know about it if you're subscribed, because this kind of content doesn't show up in mainstream recommendations. The algorithm doesn't like things that make people uncomfortable, that challenge fundamental assumptions, that demand actual thinking instead of passive consumption. So if you want to keep learning, if you want to keep questioning, if you want to develop the kind of awareness that protects you from manipulation and self-deception, subscribe. Turn on notifications and show up ready to have your mind bent in ways you didn't think were possible, because reality is stranger than you think. Your brain is weirder than you know, and the only way out is through understanding. See you in the next one, if you're brave enough to keep questioning.